On a cold afternoon in 1929, dozens of people walked into a cinema expecting nothing more than a few hours of escape, but within minutes, panic took over, and by the time it was over, 71 people were dead. And what makes this story even more disturbing is that the fire everyone believed was killing them had already been put out before we uncover what really happened inside that cinema. Subscribe now. Because the stories on this channel are not just history, they are warnings hidden in the past. Paisley in the late 1920s was not a place where people expected disaster. It was a working town, built on routine, familiarity, and community, the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where daily life followed a predictable rhythm, and where small comforts mattered more than anything else. Work was often difficult, money was limited, and opportunities were not always guaranteed. But there were moments that allowed people to step away from all of that, and one of those moments was the cinema. By the end of the decade, going to the pictures had become part of everyday life, not a rare event, but something woven into the weekly routine, especially for younger audiences. It was a place where the outside world disappeared, where stories replaced reality, and where a dark room filled with strangers somehow felt safe. And that sense of safety is important, because it explains why no one questioned the building itself. The Glen Cinema had been there for years. It was familiar, trusted, and visited again and again. But what most people never thought about was what the building had originally been designed for. It was not built as a cinema. It had been converted from a hall meant for gatherings, not for large crowds needing immediate exits. The seating was tightly arranged, the corridors were narrow, and the exits were limited. But none of that mattered on normal days, because nothing had ever gone wrong. And that is often how risk hides, quietly, inside places that appear completely safe, waiting for a moment when those hidden weaknesses are finally tested. On the afternoon of December 31st, that test began without warning. Families were preparing for the evening, homes were being cleaned, meals were being prepared, and as part of that routine, people were sent to the cinema. It was a simple decision, one that had been made countless times before. The building filled quickly. Rows of seats packed, voices filled the air, laughter, excitement, energy. Everything felt normal. Inside the projection area, work continued as it always did, film reels being handled, rewound, and stored, but the material used at the time was highly unstable, capable of igniting under the right conditions, and that day, something small went wrong, a short circuit, a reaction, and suddenly smoke began to appear. It was not an explosion, not a massive fire spreading across the building. It was something much smaller, contained, and already being dealt with. But the problem was not the size of the fire. The problem was what people believed it was, because in a dark, crowded space, perception matters more than reality. Someone noticed the smoke, someone reacted, and within seconds, the idea of fire spread faster than the smoke itself. Panic does not need confirmation, it only needs a trigger, and once it starts, it moves through a crowd instantly. People began to move, not because they understood the situation, but because everyone else was moving, and that movement had only one direction, toward the exits. But the building had never been designed for that kind of response. The corridors were narrow, the pathways limited, and the exit points were few. What had been acceptable during normal conditions became dangerous under pressure. Within seconds, hundreds of people were trying to move through spaces that could not support them. Those at the front slowed. Those behind continued pushing, and pressure began to build. The exit that should have provided safety became something else entirely. Because of the way it opened, the force of people pushing from behind made it impossible to open from the inside, turning it into a barrier instead of an escape. And in that moment, the disaster changed form. It was no longer about smoke or fire. It was about force, about bodies compressed into a space that could not release them, about movement turning into pressure, and pressure turning into something deadly. Those further back had no idea what was happening ahead. They continued pushing forward, driven by fear, while those at the front were trapped, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to escape. The situation escalated in seconds. People fell, others fell on top of them, and the space filled rapidly, not with flames, but with panic and compression. Outside, the first signs of something being wrong began to appear. People heard noise, saw movement, and began to gather, at first confused, then alarmed, and then desperate to help. Windows were broken, attempts were made to reach inside, but the structure itself slowed everything down. Access points were limited, and the pressure inside made it difficult to even create space to reach those trapped. By the time help began to break through, the outcome had already been decided. The movement inside had stopped, not because the danger was gone, but because there was no room left for movement at all. When rescuers finally entered, what they found did not match what they expected. There was no large fire sweeping through the building, No widespread flames, instead there was silence, and the realization that began to settle was deeply unsettling. People had not died from the fire itself, they had died because of everything around it: the design of the building, the direction of a door, the lack of space, the absence of controlled evacuation, all small details that had never seemed important before. But together, they created a situation where escape became impossible, and in the aftermath, the town faced something that could not be easily understood: loss on a scale that touched nearly every part of the community. The emotional impact was immediate, but so were the questions. How could something like this happen in a place that felt so familiar? And the answers pointed not to a single failure, but to a system of overlooked risks, conditions that had existed for years without consequence, until the moment they were tested. In the months that followed, investigations revealed the deeper truth: that the building had not been suitable for the purpose it was serving, that safety measures had not kept pace with usage, and that the disaster was the result of multiple small factors aligning at once. And that is what makes this story so important, because it shows that disasters are rarely caused by a single event, they are built over time, through decisions that seem insignificant, through systems that are assumed to be safe until they are not. Changes came after, regulations improved, safety standards were strengthened, and buildings were redesigned with better exits and clearer evacuation systems. But those changes came too late for the people who were there that day, and more than anything else, the story leaves behind a lesson that still matters now: that safety is not something that can be assumed, it must be actively built, maintained, and questioned, because the most dangerous places are not always the ones that look unstable. Sometimes they are the ones that feel completely safe, until one small moment reveals everything that was wrong all along.